Jeff Greenberg says the Detroit Tigers will prioritize pitching this winter. Let's talk about it all today on Locked On Tigers.
You are Locked On Tigers, your daily Detroit Tigers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another edition of Locked On Tigers. I'm, of course, your host, Scott Bentley. Today is Friday, November 14th, 2025. Thank you so much for making Locked On Tigers your first listen every single day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts, including YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every single day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can bet just $5, and if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. So download the app today. Welcome in, everybody. Welcome all. Happy Friday. Hopefully we can send you off into the weekend here with a good show. Going to talk about a few things today. We'll kind of piggyback off of the conversation yesterday about greatest Tigers pitcher of all time at the end. Also want to talk about Trey Sweeney and just kind of his role on the team this year. We'll do his player review and talk about what his role could be in the organization in 2026. We have a Tuesday deadline. That's a very, very big one in the offseason we'll discuss as well. But I want to start off with what I believe is the biggest talking point to come out of Thursday, and that is that Jeff Greenberg spoke a little bit at the end of GM meetings and talked about the priority of starting pitching this offseason. Scott Boras also continued to speak more in weird riddles and whatnot. Essentially, Scott Boras said, Tarik Skubal is willing to sign. Great, dude. That's awesome. That means absolutely nothing to me. He can say that publicly and then just ask for $500 million behind closed doors. Like that, I don't care about quotes. This is all just part of the game, okay? Skubal says he wants to be in Detroit for a long time. I believe him. I also believe that that's only half of that sentence. I believe that it's I want to stay in Detroit for a long time, assuming they pay me what I am worth. Now, what he is worth in my eyes, like he has earned that. Just won back-to-back Cy Youngs, has been pretty objectively the best pitcher in the American League for 2.5 years now. Jeff Greenberg mentioned a few different things. I think in regards to his comments on Tarik Skubal, it was more about what he didn't address. Was asked about teams, calling the Tigers in regards to Tarik Skubal's trade availability and whatnot. And he gave the same answer that Scott Harris gave. And for those who don't know, Jeff Greenberg, the general manager of the Detroit Tigers. However, Scott Harris is the president of baseball operations, and he is the top dog, metaphorically speaking, in our front office. But Jeff Greenberg, very much his right-hand man, kind of has his hands in everything. Give the same answer that Harris gave at the end of season media availability with Harris and Hinch. And that was, I'm not going to talk about or comment on what other teams have offered or what other teams have called us about. Because that's not, and like that's, like he's professional. Like I guess that's somewhat fair. It's the same. Like obviously teams are calling about Skubal. I don't know. I am not a front office personnel like member. Okay. I'm underthinking this, but like what hurt is it going to be like, yeah, like some people are obviously calling about the best pitcher in baseball that we haven't extended yet. Like that feels fairly obvious. It's being like, oh, we have no comment. Okay, cool. Whatever. The biggest quote to come out of it was the fact that Greenberg said that the Tigers rather were going to prioritize pitching this offseason. I do find the optics, and there is more nuance to this conversation than just well, you have the best pitcher in baseball, and like, so you should maybe extend him because why are you saying you want pitching? I understand. I'm just optically, it made me giggle. That's all. It just made me kind of, tee hee hee a little bit. Like, we're in the process of talking about arguably the greatest pitcher breathing air right now. And then you're going to turn around and immediately be like, well, we're going to prioritize pitching. That's all. That being said, I actually do agree that pitching should be a priority. Again, way more nuance to it than that. It just made me laugh. They need to shore up the rotation, and that's something I've talked about a couple of times already this offseason. But far more importantly, I would even say, than the rotation, because like if the season started tomorrow, you would have 5 bodies plus, Sir Gibson Long, Cater Montero. Like, you could probably piece your way through a season with the starting pitchers you have right now. Now, you shouldn't. Please don't do that. Please go sign. I said this, about a week ago, maybe a little bit longer. I am hoping the Detroit Tigers sign multiple starting pitchers. That is my wish list, okay? So I'm not advocating for them to not. I'm just saying you could have a starting rotation of 5 guys after Flaherty, picked up the player option for 2026. The bullpen is a massive necessity. If the season started tomorrow and they walked in with the bullpen they have right now, I would be furious. And Greenberg, to his credit, and the front office's credit, said the same thing. I believe the word was certainly before stating that he needed to address, they certainly need to address the bullpen. And we've talked about that plenty as well. I think to put a bow on these comments, so we can move on to segment 2 here, I also just hope that this doesn't mean they aren't going to address the offense in any serious capacity. Because while I do agree that they need to sign a handful of pitchers this winter, and that I don't need an entire new offense, there is also, I think, still 1 or 2 holes. And there's still 1 or 2 holes. Like, you should still address those and still fill those needs. So they're just comments. We are at the point in the offseason in mid-November here where we are just hyper and over analyzing everything. Okay, I take this all with a grain of salt. We can move on to bigger and better things. I just found the comments noteworthy enough to bring up and wanted to at least point out, A, I agree. B, you have the best pitcher in baseball. C, still sign bats. Cool. Now that we covered all those bases, pun intended, we will move on to the Tuesday deadline that marks a very important date in the Tigers offseason. We'll talk about that right after this. First, though, I'm going to talk to you all about our friends over at FanDuel. The NBA is back, and there's no better place to get in on all of the action than FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Even if you miss the start of a game or you want to ride the hot hand, FanDuel has live bets on everything from who will score next to fourth quarter comebacks. Plus, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay for a shot at a bigger payout. It keeps every game exciting, especially when your team is making a late push. So right now, FanDuel is giving new customers $300 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. So head to FanDuel.com and sign up today and play your game with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, everybody, welcome back here. Segment 2 of Locked On Tigers. Appreciate y'all for tuning in. As always, making us your first listen every single day. Shout out to the everydayers that do tune in every day. And we will, of course, be back on Monday as we prepare you for Rule 5 protection deadline, qualifying offer deadline, etc. that all come at the beginning of next week and at the end, non-tender deadline on Friday of next week. So thank you for tuning in and making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network. In segment 1, we talked a little bit about Tarik Skubal and Scott Boras. We talked about Jeff Greenberg's comments at the end of GM meetings. I want to talk about the next stage in the offseason now. We've moved on from GM meetings. Winter meetings now loom. Those take place a couple weeks into December. But next week is a very pivotal part of the MLB offseason. Tuesday, that's the 18th, I believe. Man, it's so weird not having my calendar in this room anymore because it was at my old place. But I believe that's the 18th. It's Tuesday, regardless. Just ignore the day maybe and just this upcoming the most recent. No, that's like past tense. The upcoming Tuesday. Sure. You have the qualifying offer deadline for players to accept or decline said qualifying offer. So Gleyber Torres, we've obviously talked a lot about that already this offseason. We will continue, I'm sure, to talk about it at the beginning of next week. But he has just a few more days, less than a week, to decide on his QO from the Detroit Tigers. We've talked about it on here. He's even like his agent and camp have even admitted like this is very much contingent on whether there is a market for Gleyber Torres in the multi-year contract facet, if you will, this winter. So we'll see what happens in regards to that. Just keep an eye out for that. Usually people wait until like the last possible second to put publicly whether they've accepted or declined, but we'll see what happens throughout the weekend. They being the Tigers, have until Tuesday to protect players from the Rule 5 draft. So on Monday or Tuesday, most likely Tuesday's show that I'll record on Monday, we will have an entire show dedicated to the Rule 5 protection deadline, as we do every year for those longtime listeners. That's always the day of that deadline. We have an entire episode dedicated and kind of dissecting who is eligible, who could get protected, who is not going to be protected, who definitely will get protected, etc. I think over the last couple of years, there's been, because we've still kind of been filtering out some of the lingering players from the uncompetitive Tigers era, we can call it, over the last like 3 or 4 years, whenever we get to this deadline. There's certainly still plenty of players that the Tigers can remove from the 40-man. We'll actually talk about that here in a few minutes. But I feel like there's not, like there was one offseason, was it last winter or 2 winters ago, where the Tigers protected 5 people from the Rule 5 draft, and that's adding 5 people to the 40-man that have never played a Major League Baseball game all at once. This year, I don't think it'll be that dramatic, but I still think there is, I think, anywhere from 2 to 4 players that we will probably be discussing. Hao-Yu Lee is a big name. Thyron Lorenzo, a big name. There's a couple of guys that are eligible that I think will be added still. So that's a big date in the offseason. Next Friday, as I already mentioned too and kind of alluded to, is the non-tender deadline. So anybody who is pre-ARB or ARB eligible has to be tendered, has to be basically the equivalent of signed a 1-year contract by the organization by then, or else they then become free agents. So after next week, that's kind of the Kickstarter, the non-tender deadline, is kind of the fire being lit on the offseason. Obviously, free agents are available now, but a lot of times after next week and after that deadline, both of these deadlines rather, is when you start seeing moves pick up a little bit more because 40-man rosters are actually finally officially set. Now, obviously, next week we'll talk about who could get added. That also leads to conversation of who could get removed. And I think that, as I mentioned, the Tigers still have plenty of opportunities and plenty of players that they could pretty easily remove from their 40-man roster. And I don't think it would be that big of a deal. Obviously, you have Jack Little and Dugan Darnell, who were both just claimed on waivers themselves in the last 10 days. So you could just try to pass them through waivers and see if you can keep them in the organization, send them to AAA, but remove them from the 40-man. You also have some other easy candidates. I think Drew Summers is probably a guy that I wouldn't bet on making it through the winter. Tanner Rainey, probably a similar conversation. Bailey Horn, I actually liked what I saw from Bailey Horn. Decent velocity from the left side this season. But that being said, I think if push came to shove and there was somebody they needed to add, they probably would still not have too much of an issue putting Bailey Horn on waivers. And then you have, a handful of guys on the offensive side of the ball that I think they would rather hold on to. But again, push come to shove, you're adding a couple of big bats and you need to clear up some space. I think Jace Young still has options left, doesn't have to, but is maybe in that conversation. Andy Ibanez kind of just flies by year to year based on his previous season production. Trey Sweeney, who we'll talk about a little bit more in a second, very intentionally. I mean, even he had a great year, but even Jahmai Jones, just because of this is certainly the outlier of his career. Maybe the Tigers don't think it's replicable. I do think Jahmai Jones makes it. I'm just throwing names out there. And then Justin Henry Malloy, we talked about last week. Dylan Smith it just keeps getting hurt, unfortunately. He's certainly a candidate. Chase Lee even, right? I'm listing all these names. All of these are varying degrees of I would be pretty surprised if Malloy didn't make it through the winter. But all of Jahmai Jones, probably a similar conversation at this point. So varying degrees, but any of these guys could be removed from the 40-man roster. And then, we'll talk plenty about the non-tender deadline, arbitration projections. We'll do all of that good stuff next week as well. Do want to talk about one player in particular on that list, and that is Trey Sweeney. We're going to do his player review today, player breakdown, whatever the heck we're calling it. Somewhat intentionally, I think that there is a remote chance that he does not make it through next Friday on the 40-man roster. I also think that it's important to talk about it now because if he does make it through, there's probably a somewhat reasonable explanation for that decision. Now, this year was a really rough year for Trey Sweeney. -1 FanGraphs WAR. One of the lowest in all of baseball. He had 196. He had next to no power to go with it. The only thing offensively that you can really say he did somewhat efficiently and effectively is he walked a decent amount, especially for a guy that pretty much didn't hit anything actually in the strike zone. For him to still walk at an 8% clip, I think is actually really impressive. So he has that going for him. But he whiffed a lot. He struck out a lot. He did not hit the ball hard when he did make contact. And he graded very poorly defensively. Now, all of that being said, he's a former first-round pick. He does have a quick swing. He is a fast bat. And that is something that is prioritized and is rewarded in baseball. It leads to a slightly different type of hitter. When you look at the Jacob Wilsons and the Luis Arraez of the world, the guys that hit for next to no power but do not swing and miss ever, those guys tend to have slow swings and very, very, those two guys specifically are the extremes. Those, and then Stephen Kwan is the third. Those three guys have pretty comfortably the three slowest swings in terms of just literally miles an hour of the bat as you swing in all of baseball. And that's why they don't swing and miss much, because their bat stays in the zone for longer than anybody else and stays on the plane, rather, that they want it to, longer than everyone else because it takes them longest to swing. And they sacrifice power to do that. Trey Sweeney has a pretty fast swing. So in theory, if you can get him to hit the ball relatively consistently, you might be able to unlock some power. We've seen that in Trey Sweeney's minor league career. He has pretty solid power numbers. Unfortunately, that does no good when you don't put the ball in play enough. You are not reaping those rewards or those benefits. And that's kind of the category that Trey Sweeney finds himself in at 25 years old now, will turn 26 next year. So let's talk about the decision that is looming. And I'm not trying to make it sound like it's a big, like Trey Sweeney's the only big decision. It's one player. I think there's actually a decent chance he makes it through the week. Would not be my first choice, but we'll talk about what is going to go into that decision with a player like Trey Sweeney right after this. All right, everybody, welcome back here. Third and final segment of Locked On Tigers. Appreciate y'all for tuning in as always. So, talking about Trey Sweeney today, we honestly, there's not even too much else to break down in terms of his 2025 season. Didn't really hit any pitch well. It was a struggle, and I really do feel for him. The reason why I don't think it's a slam dunk necessarily to non-tender him is because he still has multiple minor league options left. And again, this is not what I would do. This is what I think is going to happen. Okay, I want to clarify that. I am not going to be extremely upset, even despite the year he had, if he's a part of the Tigers organization next year. If he's on the 40-man roster even. If the Tigers still believe that they can tweak some things in his swing and that he can be something, the minor league options exist for that reason. And again, when looking at the rest of the 40-man roster, there are plenty of players to choose from to remove from the 40-man if you still think that Trey Sweeney could be a solid Major League Baseball player. What is clear to me is that he is not a Major League Baseball player today. And that's fine. Some people take longer to develop. Again, you have minor league options for a reason. So if you want to keep him, it isn't necessarily required to boot him from the 40 or to move him this winter. And for that reason, I actually think he's going to stick around. What I do need is for the roster to get to a point where Trey Sweeney is not in a Detroit Tigers uniform on opening day. I'm fine if he's on the 40. I do have an issue if he's in Detroit. He should not be playing at the Major League level to start off the 2026 season, or else we have done nothing this winter. He played in 118 games in 2025 with those numbers I just relayed to you. That cannot happen again. It can't, unless his production turns around, obviously. Barring a magnificent turnaround, which obviously we would all welcome, or a ton of injuries ahead of him, he cannot be playing over half the season or over 110 games, 115 games at the Major League level in 2026. It was an automatic out in the lineup, and it was not good defense to be a pair with it. He carved out a role just by being the only other guy besides Javi that could start at shortstop. That is just simply not enough to garner everyday playing time like he did in 2025 and 2026. So that's kind of my piece. If it were up to me, I mean, again, there's a lot more nuance to it. I think you probably have to, I don't know. I would not be against, if he is non-tendered, I'm not going to be upset either, obviously. I would welcome that. That probably is what I would do. I'm just laying it out there that if it doesn't happen, don't feel like it's the end of the world. It's okay, and there's a little bit of logic and reasoning to that. Other news from around the league on Thursday really the only other thing I want to bring up is just the players to coaches pipeline is scorching hot at the present moment. Max Stassi is now the catching coach in LA for the Angels, and Travis Jankowski is now the first base coach for the Rangers. Both of those gentlemen, 34 years old, and played pro baseball in 2025. Like, just played games a few weeks ago. And so I ask you, similar to when the Giants hired the manager of the University of Tennessee, and when I asked you then if that was going to be a trend, I ask you the same thing now. Is players immediately retiring to become coaches going to be more popular in this new era of baseball because these guys played with all of the measurements and metrics and whatnot? And so it's like, oh, well, this guy clearly knows what we're trying to do here. So let's just hire him as a coach immediately. Jankowski literally played over 100 games in 2024 and played for 3 different major league teams in 2025. You have a front office that knows your skill set, they know what you're good at, and they know that you know what they are trying to do. Wow, a lot of they know, you know, what we know, what they're trying to. You know, you're hiring someone that is bought in to the culture and to the strategy, the X's and O's that you are trying to implement. Now, maybe this is an outlier. Maybe I'm just overthinking this, and it's like these two guys they did it at the same time, and because they were coach material and always have been, and it's just a complete coincidence. And it's just a thought I had. So I thought I'd throw it back out there. Some great responses to the end of yesterday's show when asking about Skubal's perceived ranking among all-time starting pitchers. Got, of course, a handful of people that just said, yes, he is. Got plenty of people that still say the cream of the crop is Verlander. Got a couple of people that said Jack Morris just because of the longevity factor, along with being the ace of the team for so long. And he was such a big game pitcher, right, in the playoffs and in the World Series. Some guys that I didn't bring up by name that were brought up a lot on the show, Denny McLain and Mickey Lolich, and certainly deserve to be in that conversation. I think now is when you start to get into the conversation of peak versus longevity, right? And that's kind of similar with Verlander and Skubal, although Verlander's peak was still literally an MVP. So maybe not a great example, but maybe it's more like Skubal versus Morris than it is Verlander. Verlander is kind of, I don't know, in a league of his own. He had both, and that's what makes him a first ballot Hall of Famer. But like, for instance, it's hard to argue there has been a better 2-year peak than McLain. That's an MVP, back-to-back Cy Youngs. Also is still to this day and may forever be the most recent 30-game winner in baseball. And the fascinating thing about that is, you know, we always hear like, oh, like the game isn't the same as it was back then, or like, you know, like, oh, it's hard to compare eras because of that. We need to remember that before McLain did it, it had not happened in 30 years. It wasn't like McLain was like, he did that and it was like, oh, like, you know, that just happens sometimes, whatever. That hadn't happened since the early 30s before he did it. So like, it truly is just him kind of in a league of his own in that regard. That is a plus a World Series ring in that 2-year stretch, and pitching 3 times in the World Series in 68, started 3 separate games. Like, that is, it's hard to argue that there is a better 2-year peak from that. You also have then Lolich, who didn't have the peak, like didn't win a Cy Young, certainly got plenty of Cy Young votes, but didn't, you know, win one, wasn't an MVP or anything like that, but was an incredible number 2 that pitched so many innings for the Tigers over his, almost 15-year Tigers tenure. And I mean, when you talk about biggest starts in Tigers history, There's going to be some Morris ones thrown out there. There's certainly going to be some Verlander ones thrown out there. It's really hard to argue that Lolich, the third time he's pitched in the World Series, pitches Game 7 of the 68 World Series against Bob Gibson, who's also pitching for the third time. In Bob Gibson, what is widely considered to be one of the greatest individual pitching performances over the course of an entire World Series ever, is Bob Gibson's 3 starts in the 68 World Series. And Lolich, McLain pitched Game 6 and won and got them to a Game 7. Lolich gets 7 and out duels. Both of them pitched complete games because it was the 60s. But he outduels them, only gives up 1 run in 9 innings, and the Tigers win the World Series. Verlander has everybody beat in terms of longevity, also as the Cy Youngs, also as the MVP. Very, very tough to argue anybody has a better resume than him. We already talked about Morris. Doesn't have the Cy Youngs or the MVPs necessarily in terms of peak. Never had like that incredible, unreal low ERA season, but was a solid 3 ERA guy that pitched in some really big games through a no-hitter, is in the Hall of Fame. And then, I mean, even going back further, Hal Newhouser. Go look at Hal Newhouser's 1945 stats. Okay? It's one of the greatest single seasons anyone has ever pitched in the history of Major League Baseball. Ultimately, there was plenty of people, and I agree with this, that just said, dude, it's really hard to compare eras. I'm not even sure it's possible. You're probably right. You're probably right. Because Newhouser threw like 315 innings in 45. Sub 2 ERA, though. He had like a 12-win season. It's awesome. Go look it up. It's your homework, if you will. And then obviously, again, you argue peak versus longevity. Everybody has a different take on that. How blessed are we, man? I retweeted this the other day, but it was making the rounds. The Tigers have had 7 Cy Young winners in franchise history, and that is in the top 3. It's tied, but in the top 3 or 4 most in the history of Major League Baseball. How lucky are we? Thanks for making Locked On Tigers your first listen every single day. Shout out to the everydayers that do tune in every day. And we, of course, will be back on Monday. Peace and love. Going to therapy's dope. I'll catch y'all then, baby. Go Tigers.